Okay, this is a slideshow on how to engage with feminist theory in a sort of fairly basic way. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background about what feminism is and feminist theory before talking about how you might actually use it to engage with your analysis of literature text. So feminist theory really in a nutshell means exploring the nature of gender inequality, gender identity, gender roles in society, and indeed in literature. What do we mean by feminism and where does it come from? Well, feminism in some form has been around probably since humans have existed. The idea that women look at their place in society and reflect on whether they have, I suppose, an equal role or whether their role is a fair one. But certainly for our purposes, in English literature, the awareness of feminism in forms of writing goes back to 1794, so even in the writing of our culture, it goes back a long way. The Vindication of the Rights of Woman by Mary Wollstonecraft, who was Mary Shelley's mother, really important even in the late 18th century. Women were starting to argue that they did not have the kinds of rights and powers that their male counterparts had. We see, I suppose, a rise in feminism and more sort of modern sense of feminist activism between 1910 and probably 1930, I would say, rather than 20 actually. But that certainly sort of centres around women during the late 19th century, early 20th century, fighting for the right to vote, which they did not have. Some men didn't have it either, but fighting for that right to vote, which they won in the UK after the First World War in 1918, and they won in the US in 1920. So to some people it's quite shocking that it was that recent, really, that women didn't have any political voice in society, our society. In the 1960s, you see another rise post Second World War in feminist discussion about not, they've won the right to vote, but women are still seeing perhaps inequalities beneath the surface and starting to challenge their gender roles, their expected career options and choices, their education. So you get a far more broad sense of a feminist movement in the 60s onwards. And arguably, feminism has never gone away and never stopped. It's changed perhaps quite a lot since the 60s and 70s, but still you've got women arguing that other women need to look at their roles in society and to challenge perhaps the male order. So that's a bit of background behind where feminism comes from and what it is. Some key terms which I think are really useful to understand. Patriarchy, which simply is a noun which describes a society centred on male power and control. Obviously, when Mary Wollstonecraft was writing, patriarchy was incredibly embedded, throughout the 18th, 19th centuries. But you can argue the 20th and the 21st centuries, are still patriarchal to an extent. Women can vote now and they have far more rights, and there are far more equal opportunities available to women. But some people still argue that Britain is, still patriarchal in many respects. Misogyny is a very important word, or if you want to use the adjective misogynistic, difficult to spell. It just means really the deliberate cruelty and aggression towards women that some feminists see as a way that men retain control of a patriarchal society. there is a sense that a feminist might see male violence towards women as a way of controlling women and retaining power. Gender roles is an important term, or gender identity, slightly different but similar. The expected roles in society for a particular gender. What does it mean to be a woman? What does it mean to be a man? So when you think about feminism, you can obviously think about gender in broader terms, male and female, and how those gender roles and gender identities differ and sometimes merge. Empowerment means, how do marginalised groups gain power? Sisterhood is an important term in talking about how women in society may group together to support each other rather, in the face of inequality. So that sense of whether women are joined and find union with one another to try and empower themselves. The male gaze, I can't remember the specific critic, I think it was a film critic who coined that phrase, but it's all about the way that women are objectified and sexualized from a male perspective in many texts and in society. We see it quite commonly in advertising. Most advertising executives are male, and a lot of sexualized images of women are obviously used in advertising, so certainly that term came about as a kind of film and media term, I think, but it's useful in thinking about literature. So that leads me on to, so what's this got to do with reading novels, plays and poetry? A hell of a lot. A feminist critic would believe that literature, novels, poems and plays reflect the societies they're produced in, and therefore the gender roles and identities of those societies. And they reveal characters adhering to or breaking traditional gender roles. So a sophisticated reader of literature might be a reader who considers, what role does gender play in a text? How does the writer analyse gender relations and identities in society? How do characters overcome restrictive gender roles within a text? In what ways does the work serve as propaganda for patriarchy, or does it try to undermine it? What does the work say about gender oppression, or are gender conflicts ignored? Does the work propose some form of solution to gender inequalities encountered in the work? So a good student is someone who will reflect on how relationships in relation to gender are presented in a piece of literature. Whether it's written, 500-600 years ago, or whether it's written in the 21st century, gender is always going to be a really important aspect of a text. If I do an example, here are those sort of sentence starters. I think the character is presented in a positive way in terms of feminist perspective, as I think the character represents male patriarchy and misogyny, as I feel the author is progressive, regressive in terms of feminism, as. So again, looking at Lady Macbeth, I did in the clip on Marxist interpretations. So I'm just looking at exactly the same quote, but I'm looking at it from a feminist perspective rather than a Marxist one. I feel the character of Lady Macbeth is symbolic of a feminist struggle for power in an unequal society. Her demands to unsex herself is a demand to release her from her restricted gender role. From a feminist perspective, I feel Shakespeare is to some extent progressive, as even though he was writing centuries before feminism, he encouraged us to see how damaging gender inequality can be. However, the text may be seen as regressive, as Lady Macbeth's attempts to empower herself lead to her psychological disintegration and suicide, perhaps suggesting women would be punished for stepping outside of traditional gender roles. So you can see how I've worked in those key terms to kind of unpick something about the way that female gender identity is presented in that text, even though it's obviously centuries before the term feminism comes about.